December the 21st, 1866. A fateful day. This is the site of the Fetterman Battle. It's perhaps a story full of truths, half-truths, and maybe some myths all mixed in. For example, it says on the monument there were no survivors. Well, there was hundreds of survivors, but they all happened to be on the Native American side. What is true, there was no survivors from the US Army. Total of 81 men very quickly lost their lives that day. I visited in early June 2022, and you can see from the scenery it was a beautiful time to visit. Clouds, some of them rain clouds forming, gave an atmospheric feel to the battlefield. But again, that's a half-truth, because on that eventful day in December it was freezing cold and there was snow on the ground. Some controversies about what actually happened here. And apart from the 81 men lost from the US Army, it's not clear how many Native Americans lost their lives. Possibly an equal number, because the ones that were wounded and were taken off the battlefield might have died later due to very rudimentary medical treatment. What is known is that Colonel Carrington had ordered Captain Fetterman to leave the fort and relieve the wood train, and specifically not to cross over Lodge Trail Ridge. Fetterman left with 49 infantry soldiers. Perhaps another surprise for somebody like me that's been brought up watching westerns with people like John Wayne and the US Cavalry, but in this battle there was more infantry soldiers than there were cavalry soldiers, and this is probably not the only example of that. Lieutenant Grumman followed out with 27 cavalry. Captain Brown, who was about to leave the fort, apparently wanted one last crack at the Indians, so he joined, and 2 civilians joined, armed with the latest Henry repeating rifles, making a total of 81 men. Again, it's been repeated many times that Captain Fetterman had made a boast that with 80 men he could ride through the Sioux Nation, and lo and behold, on this very day he had 81 men. Now, is that a truth or a myth, or was that saying attributed to him many years later, and it conveniently matched the actual events? Who knows at the end of the day? You can all make your own judgments on that. Captain Fetterman was a distinguished Civil War hero. He had extensive action in the Civil War, but he was new to the Plains Wars, although in the previous 2 weeks he'd been in action a number of times. In fact, on one occasion where the warriors had managed to lure away some of the cavalry soldiers, where 2 of them were killed, a Lieutenant Bingham and one of the sergeants. He then had reported that words to the effect that this Indian war was becoming hand to hand and one had to be extremely cautious. What we do know is that Carrington's orders not to cross Lodge Trail Ridge weren't followed, that's for sure. Why is not absolutely clear. We know that the Indians or the Native American warriors, I'd rather say, under Red Cloud, had set up a deliberate deception plan that day, and they used decoys, and Crazy Horse was numbered to be one of them, to lure the soldiers over the ridge and follow them, which at some stage they did. Then they sprung the trap with upwards of 2,000 warriors attacking these 81 men. Lakota Sioux, Cheyenne, Arapaho. For the men involved on the US Army side, it must have been an absolutely frightening experience to suddenly realise what they were up against. 2,000 warriors descending on. Battle lasted perhaps 30 to 40 minutes when they were all annihilated. Number of reasons perhaps behind that. Some of the weaponry involved, the cavalrymen were armed with a 7-shot Spencer repeater rifle, where the infantry were still using the Springfield rifle single shot muzzle loading. It obviously took time to load and fire. That might have been a contributory factor. But probably the main factor of all was what's known as the fog of war. They just didn't realise, perhaps a little bit like Custer 10 years later, the amount of warriors they were up against. So they had poor intelligence in terms of the enemy and their movements. Because surely, if they had realised they were up against 2,000, they would never have come down off that ridge. Probably, if Colonel Carrington had known that many hostiles were in the neighbourhood, he wouldn't have even sent out the wood train that day, but more likely would have prepared the fort for a siege or an attack. Very interesting place to visit. It has got an atmosphere about it. As I say, on a June day it was a beautiful spot. There are lots of signs, as you can see, laid out explaining the battlefield. In the background you can see views of the Interstate 90, and if you're passing on that and you wanted to view this, you come off at exit 44, and it's a very short drive then to this battlefield. Two of the civilians with some of the cavalry were held out in some of the rocks. Their names are sort of very faded in the rock, and because they had the Henry repeaters, they were able to give a good account of themselves. And when the bodies were recovered, I think up to 60 blood stains had been shown near where they were. So as I mentioned, maybe the native warriors' casualties were equal, if not more, than the American Army casualties. So, as I mentioned, lots of signs that you can follow. The trail from the monument to where these rocks are is, I guess, about a mile long. It's an easy walk of a mile. That ridge we walked on is named as Massacre Hill. But in reality, that's a bit of a myth, isn't it? It wasn't a massacre. A massacre, I view, is where you've got, over centuries in all countries, soldiers have murdered innocent civilians and unarmed civilians. This was a battle between two sets of men. One side you had the US Army, the cavalry and the infantry, and on the other side you had the warriors of the tribes. Due to superior tactics and obviously very superior numbers, this was a victory for the warriors this day. Captain Fetterman and his command are now buried at a national memorial at the Battle of the Little Bighorn site. Rest in peace.